You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support this show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Thursday, August 23rd, 2018. My name is Michael Brooks on a hybrid Michael Brooks, Sam Steeder Thursday. I'll explain that in a minute. And this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Martha Nussbaum. She's a professor of philosophy at Chicago University. Sam spoke with her about her new book and coming together as a civil society. Be an interesting conversation. The murder of Molly Tibbetts is being used by Fox News and the far right to lie and make assertions about undocumented people, which of course are not borne out by the evidence. A lone Manafort juror convicted, blocked the jury from finding him guilty on all 18 convictions, though they did find him guilty of 8 counts. Trump, he's amusing. Pardoning Manafort seems to be in the addled cards of Donald Trump's corroded brain. Duncan Hunter, he used campaign funds for everything from burgers to a ticket for his pet rabbit. He was crushing it with his wife, and he's likely to be sent back to Congress in November. We'll explain why. Senate Democrats are finally pouncing, using the Cohen guilty plea to say we should not be voting to make a decades-long reactionary Supreme Court by confirming Brett Kavanaugh. You guys stole a Supreme Court seat from Obama and the Democrats for literally the reason that it was an election year. Let's use the fact that 2 key associates of the president, one was convicted and the other just pleaded guilty to major crimes, and the fact that there's an ongoing, essentially organized criminal investigation of all these people, maybe that should impact the vote on Brett Kavanaugh. Betsy DeVos is weighing whether to let federal school districts local school districts use federal funds to buy guns, and Lula da Silva has increased his lead in the Brazilian presidential elections, even as he is still in jail under the coup administration of the Brazilian government. And guess who doesn't like democracy? The financial press is freaking, even as Mexico's former center-right foreign minister says Lula should run. All that and more on today's Majority Report. The team is here, minus the 4-day work week man. Samantha is out and about. Brendan on the motherfucking 1s and 2s.
Hello.
Jamie.
Hey.
With the Posadist insight, clicking the videos. And Matt in the co-commander chair.
I like that.
Like
this is
that?
a bit like
That's how I think of it when I'm there.
It does feel a bit like a spaceship,
doesn't it? This is an extremely spaceship set.
Matt, if you're trying to get the pins to be visible, they're kind of blocked by the
mic,
stand.
Well, I'll just mention the pins here. Ronald Reagan sent me a couple of pins. One says Ike and Dick, and then the other one is Democrats for Nixon Lodge, 1960. So
those are cool. I wonder where he got those.
I don't know.
I'm gonna need to get. I want some probably like a Mandela 94 pin, maybe like a Lula 2002 pin or something. I'd like some global, and also anything with the Ayatollah on it would be appreciated, of course.
Jamie, are there any pins that you are looking to acquire?
Yeah.
Any political pins?
Jews for Dinkins, maybe.
I don't know. Maybe I could repurpose an old Nixon pin in service of Miranda, who's going to fix the subways.
Oh, nice.
By the way, I love you went from, I would say, something of a Cynthia Nixon skeptic to, I would say that is the most effective Cynthia Nixon endorsement I've heard in media.
Oh my God.
Let's repurpose a Nixon button in support of Miranda, who's going to fix the subway. I like that.
I mean,
I like that a lot.
support her. I was always going to vote for her, guys.
I know. No,
I just didn't
there's nothing wrong with being
think
a little
it really made sense for DSA. But
as Waz asked me on Woke Bros, I get Cuomo's terrible, but I don't know, Mike. It just seems like a goofy white lady. Am I wrong? Don't worry, people. I explained that he was wrong, and Waz was convinced. I just thought the framing of the question was funny. But seriously, vote for Cynthia Nixon and Zephyr Teachout. And also, I would say real quick, actually, just apropos of nothing, I think Andrew Gillum in Florida, who Bernie just endorsed, the mayor of Tallahassee, who could be the first black governor of Florida and is running on a real left vote expansion ticket, is good. And Stacey Abrams is a big deal. They're purging voters. He's already done that. The Secretary of State, Brian Kemp. The shutting down of polling stations in Randolph County is part of, obviously, a national ongoing assault on voting and civil rights by Republicans, including, of course, the Roberts Court during the Bush several years ago during the Obama administration, gutting the Civil Rights Act. And Stacey Abrams can win that race. So I just want to sort of do that tour. Cynthia and Zephyr in New York, Andrew Gillum in Florida, Stacey Abrams in Georgia. Some very important races. So I said a couple of months ago, and it's not because, this is just trend watching here, not crystal balling, that, and I don't mean crystal ball. I like crystal ball's work. I mean crystal balls. Remember, Crystal Ball? Remember her?
I don't know.
No, you don't. There was literally used to. I think she's still. I don't know where she's at now, but she was a Democratic pundit on MSNBC. She literally was called Crystal Ball.
I hope she didn't take offense to every time somebody said, "Let's crystal ball this." I mean the concept crystal ball, not the actual pundit.
Yeah. Please don't take offense. That the alt-right and global white nationalists were all over the idea of land reform and expropriation without compensation in South Africa. Now, this has a long history, obviously, in South Africa, and it's a simple history for purposes of this. I'm going to go into this much more deeply on Friday on the Michael Brooks Show because we'll have more time. But obviously, look, South Africa was governed by an apartheid regime, which sort of didn't, I would say, fully, it transitioned in the late 80s and early 90s, and it ended, fully with the election of Nelson Mandela as president in 1994. The economic arrangements were not really touched, and people like Ronnie Kasrils, who was an ANC operative and revolutionary who served in Mandela and in Mbekis's governments, who I've had the privilege of interviewing several times, he said we had a political but not an economic liberation. And that's one of the reasons that South Africa has had corruption problems, has ongoing security problems, and inequality. There needs to be a orderly, nonviolent reclaiming and redistribution of some land. And everybody accepts that. In fact, that was part of the initial 1994 moderate rainbow constitution. The ANC currently under Cyril Ramaphosa, who is a billionaire, and very much of the Davos set, is implementing a very modest land expropriation without compensation. We're not talking about what happened in Zimbabwe. And I'll just mention that for a second, because in Zimbabwe, and the racism of this is obvious, okay? Zimbabwe is the big freak-out example that people use because Mugabe ordered out white farmers in several years ago. I don't remember the specific dates when Mugabe began that program. But what he did was essentially give to political cronies he rewarded and kicked people off of productive farms, right? There wasn't a structure to it. There wasn't really much of a design to it, and it was an abusive process. But the process, the idea of land reform has never been called into account by anybody involved in any type of liberation struggles. And the reason for that is obvious, because this land was literally stolen. And you can't address the structural inequalities of a place like South Africa without empowering black farmers, as an example. So what they're proposing in South Africa is a modest social democratic, an absolutely necessary policy step, which, by the way, if you're on the neoliberal end of this, there is a populist, not really left, but very populist party in South Africa called the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by a guy named Julius Malema, who has praised Mugabe. And there's also a resurgence of white Afrikaner sentiment in South Africa. And there's been Israeli security trainers flown to white South African farms to train them in security forces, going back to the close relationship between apartheid South Africa and Israel, including Israel's support of a nuclear weapons program under the apartheid government. So that's the actual politics and context for it. And it requires some explanation, because in the alt-right, there has been a mission to first demonize Nelson Mandela, who, of course, is more of a complex figure than the kind of simplified version we get, but is still undeniably one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century, who led an undoubtedly righteous and correct cause and was correctly universally admired and acclaimed, as was the African National Congress, whatever its current problems. They have been attacking the legacy of liberation, mirroring the arguments from the 80s that white nationalists around the Reagan administration used. And now they're in a moment when, by the way, these are just policy talks. There have been no actual government-sanctioned land reforms. There have been some violence against white farmers, but that has nothing to do with either a policy directive of the African National Congress government in any way, shape, or form, and has more to do with crime problems in South Africa, which are due to ongoing structural inequality and have not changed since the 90s. They might have accelerated in certain areas, but they're not sort of a major departure. This is now a major bailiwick of white nationalists and racists. And, of course, that leads me to be talking about Tucker Carlson, who did this segment.
President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has begun, and you may have seen this in the press, seizing land from his own citizens without compensation because they are the wrong skin color. That is literally the definition of racism. Racism is what our elites say they dislike most. Donald Trump is a racist, they say. But they paid no attention to this at all. In fact, Ramaphosa is one of Barack Obama's favorite leaders in the world. In a speech just a few weeks ago, Obama praised him. He praised the racist government of South Africa and Ramaphosa by name for, quote, inspiring hope throughout the country. Does our current bureaucratic elite agree with that?
So this is an insane, paranoid, and again, a demented read of a guy who has become, I believe, actually a billionaire when he was deployed by the ANC into the private sector. And the most salient critiques of Cyril Ramaphosa are things like his essentially being complicit, as far as I understand, in the Marikana massacre in 2012 when he was on a board of directors of a mining company where police killed striking miners. On Thursday in the Financial Times, Ramaphosa, and just want to underline, he outlined his land program in the Financial Times. He didn't write it for Counterpunch. It wasn't on a Posadas podcast. This was the Financial Times. He wrote, among the greatest obstacles to growth is the severe inequality between black and white South Africans. For the South African economy to reach its full potential, it is necessary significantly to narrow gaps in income, skills, assets, and opportunities. Okay, this is perfect centrist neoliberal discourse. Land ownership is one of the areas where this disparity is most devastating, he writes, citing the World Bank and listing it as the second biggest obstacle in fighting poverty after skills. That's the World Bank, another bastion of globalist communism. But, I say that in sarcasm. Look at the frame of that segment. Tucker is actually saying that. He is actually going not only alt-right, but John Bircher there, that institutions like the World Bank are communist. And so he explains that the ANC's, and I'm quoting now from a South African summary of this, the ANC's position on changing the constitutions to enable expropriation without compensation, saying that while the Constitution currently doesn't prohibit it, the ANC's views that an amendment would provide certainty and clarity. He emphasizes that the amendment would need to reinforce the fundamental principles of the property cause, including the prohibition of, quote, the arbitrary deprivation of property, and outline some instances where the expropriation without compensation might be justified. Listen to how unbelievably moderate this would actually be in practice. Unused land. This is Ramaphosa. Unused land, derelict buildings, purely speculative land holdings, or circumstances where occupiers have a strong historical rights and title holders do not occupy or use this land, such as labor tenancy, informal settlements, and abandoned inner-city buildings. Okay, not only are these policies right for South Africa, they should be implemented here. They should be implemented in the United Kingdom. They should be implemented everywhere. That list has nothing about violence. It has nothing about removing people from a home to reward a political crony, as did partially happen in Zimbabwe. So the objections to this are pure racism, white paranoia, white identity politics, and the creeping fear of global oligarchy. Because the implications of a policy as moderate as that is maybe at some point there is going to be some small measure of public accountability for the rentier class globally, starting with the most obscene, which is like the extension of literally the mass stolen land of South Africa, which created the apartheid state, whose economic mechanisms are still in place going back to the 1990s because the fundamental economic arrangements weren't touched after the essential and necessary liberation. I said a couple of months ago that this racism and this conspiracy theories were going to work their way to our racist, addled, stupid, but Twitter perceptive president, and here he is last night. This is Donald Trump. I have asked Secretary of State Mike Sec Pompeo to closely study South African land and farm seizures and expropriations and the large-scale killing of farmers. South African government is now seizing land from white farmers, quote unquote, at Tucker Carlson, at Fox News. Now, again, there have been some terrible stories of people being hurt on farms that fits into a broader problem of inequality and violence in South Africa, which, by the way, if you want to talk about the history of violence in South Africa and who might have learned some of these techniques, one would have to study the history. Well, last thing I'll add, I mean, people say, oh, how could the Congo have such examples of, how could some factions in the Congo Civil War be so violent? Where did they learn to do things like, cut off people's hands? I don't know, maybe from the Belgian occupiers that skinned people's bodies alive when they didn't, work efficiently enough at extracting resources for colonial occupiers. There's always a history to these things. And once again, what Ramaphosa has outlined is, and I'll just quote one more time, unused land, derelict buildings, purely speculative land holdings, or circumstances where occupiers have a strong historical rights and title holders do not occupy or use this land, such as labor tenancy, informal settlements, and abandoned inner-city buildings. You have a centrist third-way government headed by an incredibly wealthy lawyer who is moderate and taking to the Financial Times to say that there will be a small, modest step in paving a way forward for the poor of South Africa in the future, as well as addressing still lived historical profound injustices. And now it's a cudgel of the worst people and most dangerous people in the world, from scum, trolls on YouTube and Twitter to the President of the United States. And that is the reality of what's happening, and that's the reality of what we'll continue monitoring. I'm sorry it took a while with that, but to me it is really important. I'm just going to read this quick, and then we'll get to the interview. BetterHelp is today's sponsor, and BetterHelp is affordable private online counseling. You get unlimited access to a licensed, trained, fully accredited therapist that's perfect for you. You can do it on your phone and computer, through text, video, voice, or video chat. They're LGBT friendly. It's great for couples counseling or anything else you're going through in life right now. All you need to do is go to betterhelp.com/majority. You fill out a questionnaire. They match you with a counselor who is perfect for you, and you can start counseling today. If you decide you don't jibe with your therapist you're matched with, you can switch whenever you want. It's less expensive than in-person counseling, but you're still getting the same great help from licensed professionals. And if you have trouble affording it, BetterHelp even has financial aid available. It's excellent. You're always connected to your counselor. You'll have unlimited access, which means you can talk to them every day if you want. You connect from anywhere you're at home, at work, or on the go, so you're not wasting your time traveling to someone's office and sitting around in the waiting room. A lot of people are not comfortable talking to a therapist in person, or they simply can't, or they simply don't have the time, or they can't afford it. BetterHelp solves all of these problems. You can sign up now and save on quality professional therapy by going to BetterHelp.com/majority. Okay, this is Sam's interview with Martha Nussbaum. Her book is called Monarchy of Fear. It's about 40 minutes, and then we will see you and take you to the fun half.
We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the Law School at the University of Chicago and author of The Monarchy of Fear, A Philosopher Looks at Our Political Crisis. Martha Nussbaum, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much, Sam. It's really a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, well, let's start with just, I guess, the question about the biggest word on the front cover of your book. Fear is written in the largest font. Let's start with that. What is fear?
Well, fear is, I think, a very primitive emotion, but it does have a content, which is it involves the idea that something that's very threatening to you or your loved ones, something you care about, is looming in front of you, and that you're not entirely in control of it. So it's a sense of powerlessness and threat. And of course, animals have it in one form, humans have it in another form. But it's an emotion that probably all animals have.
And the argument that when we talk about the monarchy, that fear is fundamental in the context of our political environment in general, or in this moment?
Well, I guess the point is it's an emotion that, of course, we need. We want to protect our lives. We want to protect our loved ones. And so I'm not in favor of getting rid of fear. But because it's very primitive, it's early in an infant's life. It's probably the first emotion that infants have when they come into this crazy world. But it's also early phylogenetically because it goes across the whole animal spectrum, and it's located really in a rather primitive part of the brain. It's an emotion that can easily get out of hand and lead us badly. And it's an emotion that conduces not to democracy, where what you need is trust, equality, rational persuasion, but rather to monarchy, because when you're afraid, you want to run for comfort. You want some big person to take care of you, and that's actually a huge danger for democracy. And at the same time, you kind of want to control other people. Fear makes you want to say, parents, come and feed me. And so you want to not just run for cover, but control the behavior of other people. And that is even more dangerous, if anything, for democracy.
How do we know when fear, a certain amount of fear is or is not justified? I mean, that baby may need to eat and may have a legitimate fear that they're going to starve. At what point do you? How do we measure that we are having?
Well, I think when we grow up, we learn that we have to examine things, and we don't just run for cover when we're afraid. And, you can see in history that politicians of one kind or another have always appeared to fear sometimes for good ends and sometimes for very bad ends. The ancient historian Thucydides depicted the Greek democratic assembly as making a very hasty and bad decision when a politician appealed to fear. He says, kill all these rebellious people and enslave the women and the children. So they decide to do that, and they send out a boat. But then another politician says, wait a minute, let's think about these arguments. Let's actually see that there's no reason to kill a huge number of people, and this is actually a bad thing to do. And he persuaded them to change their mind, but since they'd already sent out the death boat, they had to send out another boat, and it was just by sheer luck that the second boat caught the first one, which had been becalmed at sea. And so, it was just by sheer luck that a whole lot of people didn't get murdered for no good reason. So basically we need to stop and think and ask, well, are these arguments good or not?
And we're speaking super generally here, but what about situations where we don't know, where there's no, the one of the dilemmas that I've had on this program since the election of Donald Trump, so we can maybe ground this a little bit more, which I think you're referring to on some level as to our political crisis, although I think it's a little broader than that. But is this concern at various points that there's an opportunity for fascism. There's an opportunity for something that is authoritarian to take hold in this country. I don't know. Let's just talk, more hypothetically about this. But and one of the central questions, at least for the first 6 to 8 months of this administration, in my mind, was how much do you engage in normal politics with the hope of bringing about better outcomes, versus how much do you not engage in those normal politics for fear that something worse could be coming down the pike? So how do you, in times where that are at least unprecedented in terms of the person experiencing it, how do you gauge as to how much fear you should appropriately have at any given point?
Well, I think it's not a matter of how much fear, but it's fear of what and for what reasons. And so, we just have to ask, what is the real problem? And I think for that reason, you don't fight one danger with another kind of hysteria. You really do have to pause and ask what the real problem is. When people feel helpless, it's not just fear, but it's often a tendency to say, we'll seize control by demonizing some other group and we'll pin the blame on them. And so then fear gets linked to anger and to hatred. And so we see that people say, the problem is the immigrants. It's not really automation, outsourcing, all the difficult technological issues that we actually face in today's economy. But that thought process can be deflected if we let either left-wing emotions or right-wing emotions take center stage in the wrong way. Sure, there are things to fear, and there are economic problems that are very difficult to solve, but it does no good to say, there's some demon in the picture, and if we just remove the demon, then everything will be hunky-dory. We have to figure out how we're actually going to solve the problem. So I'm not in favor of creating an alternative demonology where it's not the immigrant demon, it's the Trump demon. I think we need to actually join together constructively to solve our problems. I give in the book one of my good examples is Martin Luther King Jr., who said, of course whites have done some terrible things, and we have to protest and we have to try to change things. But we don't do that by creating a new set of demons. We need to try to figure out how to work together to solve our problems. And I really do think both left and right need to do that.
Well, I was going to, this is getting a little ahead of myself, but granted, when you cite Martin Luther King in that situation, and you also refer to Gandhi as well, and Mandela too, there was also, there's also a significant amount of violence that's being waged by others that for which a guy like Gandhi, frankly, as well. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of violence leading up to Gandhi's time in terms of rebelling against the British. Certainly, Mandela, the ANC, was engaging in violence. For Martin Luther King, you had Malcolm X and separatists who were threatening as well. Like, to what extent, when you cite King, are you citing just from his philosophy you appreciate, or from a practical standpoint? Don't these figures also provide an opportunity as like an escape valve in some ways for the pressure that's being placed upon the power that is going to cede some of that power?
Yeah, no, you've asked a very important question about. I think it is very important to separate the goal from the strategy, and I would say that what all three have in common is a goal of cooperation, work, solving problems through love and hope, and ultimately working together in a constructive way. In other words, rejecting the retributive idea that we just want an eye for an eye, violence for violence. Now, that doesn't mean that you never would use violence. I'm not a pacifist. I think most people who are going to be listening out there are not pacifists. So, if your well-being is threatened, as I think the Second World War was an example where the use of violence in self-defense was justified. I do think there are such cases. Now, King said that. I mean, he said, actually, when your physical well-being is threatened, it's justifiable ethically to use violence in self-defense. So his reason for not using any violence in his movement was strategic. It was not philosophical. Whereas Mandela just decided, we've tried all these strategies, and at this point, a limited use of violence is the only course that we can take. So he and King were not disagreeing. They were in different situations, and nonviolence just hadn't gotten us anywhere in the case of Mandela. But the point is, the use of violence in the Mandela case was short-term. It was highly limited because it wasn't in order to demonize, beat down, humiliate, destroy the other side. It was to bring the other side to the table for negotiation and ultimately for a shared creation of a new country. And so, it's fine to say that in some circumstances we may have to use violence, but if your aim is constructive and not retributive, then you will use it quite differently.
So if it's a threat and we're providing it out, it's very different than violence for its own sake.
Well, I mean, if it's not only not for its own sake, but not just for the sake of putting down, humiliating, and getting back at the enemy. That was what Malcolm X said we should be doing. And so this is the disagreement between Malcolm X and King. The King says, no, ultimately, we want to create something. We want to build something together, and that needs everyone's participation. How we're going to get there is the next question. But he and Malcolm X were actually disagreeing about first principles, at least King thought they were. Malcolm X thought the main aim is to pay back, and it's to put down the people who have put us down. And King says that can't be the aim, because in the end, we got to live together. We've got to work together, and so we need to build in ourselves and in the movement other emotions that are going to carry us into the future of a shared country.
All right, and so I guess to the extent that if we take even a step, I guess if we go up to 30,000 feet, it's quite possible that maybe not specifically as articulated by Malcolm X, but the idea of violence brewing simultaneously had that same functioned in the same mechanism as, let's say, Mandela was using of violence. That the threat of violence, whether it was being articulated for its own sake or whether it was strategic, and I accept maybe the interpretation that it was not necessarily strategic, but it functioned strategically insofar as there was genuine concern, I think, amongst the powerful, that we may not be able to contain this, and that we need to address this problem in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have addressed it simply if it was just a function of, it's the right thing to do.
Look, the key move that King makes, and that I think is absolutely fundamental, is to separate the protest part of anger from the payback part. So King says, look, of course we must protest, and we must protest very vigorously, putting our own bodies on the line. That's what he called direct action. But that is one issue, and the payback idea, namely that we do it in order to retaliate, to give them a taste of their own medicine, all that stuff, that's not what we're doing. So he said that people come to the movement not having made that distinction. They come with just ordinary anger, where you basically want to strike back. And then he used two words, purified and channelized. Their anger has to be purified by lopping off the aim of mere payback, but building on different aims that are constructive. So how are we going to actually solve the problem in our country? So I think that's the crucial move. And then it's only later that you would get to the question whether any kind of strategic use of violence is going to be part of the strategy that you have going forward. But you've first got to get rid of this idea that payback is what we're really in the business of seeking.
Okay, fair enough. And so when we talk about our when you talk about our political crisis, what constitutes our political crisis now?
I think the core of it is that people are not able to sit down together and talk to each other. There's such extreme polarization. And, as somebody who teaches students of all kinds, law students, PhD students in philosophy, and undergraduates, I see students of all those kinds are more polarized than ever before. And they won't take a class from somebody who seems to be on the other side of the political spectrum, so I have to try to be devious and teach with somebody whose views are very different, so they can't get out of it by saying, oh, Nussbaum's on the left, I won't take a class with her. Or, by the same token, my co-teacher who's more conservative, they can't say, well, Will Bode is on the right, I won't take a class with him. If we're teaching together, they got to be there together, and the two groups are sitting in the same room. But, it's hard. It shouldn't be that hard. People should seek out discussion with people who don't agree with them, and it isn't that way anymore. It's changed since even since I started teaching at University of Chicago, which is 23 years ago. It's gotten much more polarized. And so if it's polarized in a university where you just assume that the business is to think and talk and figure things out, how much more is it polarized in the rest of the society? It's polarized in families. I mean, I certainly encounter this in my own family, and it's hard to talk to people who are different in politics, much harder than it is to talk to people who differ by religion or by, sexual orientation or other things. So I find that very threatening for democracy.
I mean, is that but is that indicative of another type of problem, or is that in and of itself just the polarization, the issue? I mean, there's got to be a reason why it's this polarized, right?
Well, I think there are reasons. Namely, there are very big, very serious problems in this country that are hard to solve. Automation taking people's jobs, the technological changes that it's hard for working class life to keep up with, the real health problems and status problems that afflict lower middle class people in this country, income stagnation. So all these are real problems, and they're new, and they really do need to be addressed. And one of the things that's not helping is the increasing and very, very high cost of higher education, which is how, people can face this if they can get a higher education, because then that's where the jobs now are. But in any case, it's hard to solve these problems. No one knows quite how to solve them. The jobs are moving to India and so on. So instead of actually solving the problems, unfortunately, a lot of our politicians are deflecting attention from the real problems and trying to pin blame on, it's immigrants that are taking your job. Now, that's actually not true. Immigration is quite low, and illegal immigrants are actually not competing with Americans for the jobs that are actually out there. But anyway, people can easily be made to believe that story. It's much easier than the story that automation is taking your jobs, because that one is actually hard to fix. So people believe these things. And I think, similarly, there are, to some lesser degree, there are false stories that are out there on the left, like the banks are your enemy and things of that ilk. So we need not to feed our anger with false stories. We have to locate the actual problem and then try to work together to solve them.
I think I take a little bit of issue with the premises. I mean, we have right now, what would be historically considered very close to full employment. We have depressed wages, but we're also simultaneously seeing a wealth and income disparity that is also nearly unprecedented in this country. We see this massive tax cut as an example, where CEOs and board of directors are pocketing tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars worth of, that they've cashed in from stock options that were inflated by buybacks. We see banks were certainly, bailed out. There was a lot of people who gambled with a lot of other people's money that cost a lot of people their homes. And the bankers did not really have any accountability from either an income or from a sort of a legal perspective. I mean, I don't think that the reality of jobs being shipped to India or China, I mean, I think there's some of that, but America hasn't lost the number of manufacturing jobs that it supposedly has. But what we have seen is stagnating wages, money going to an increasingly smaller group of people. I mean, we can see it in things like Social Security is capturing 7, 8, 10% less than it used to in terms of incomes. I mean, so these things are not. They're not fictions.
Look, the stagnation of incomes in lower middle class people is a source of not just economic hardship, which it is to some extent, but I think even more it's the source of a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness, because up until now people have fed their hopes on the so-called American dream that you're going to do a little bit better than your father did, right. Your children are going to do a little bit better than you did, and all of a sudden, if their children are going to do better than they did, they need a college education. There is no way that because manufacturing jobs are not that numerous, there are jobs, but they're not in the sector that a lot of working class people have heretofore been qualified for, and then no one is helping them make that transition to higher education or providing intermediate kind of vocational education. Now, I'm not saying no one, because I think some states are doing things on this, and some cities, including my own, have some interesting programs in that area. But in general, it's a feeling of your status has gone down, and it's gone down vis-a-vis what you expected, but it's also gone down vis-a-vis, for one thing, women. Men are suddenly feeling like women are outperforming, and as they indeed are in higher education across all countries in the world, by the way. The enrollment of women in tertiary education is ahead of that of men in every country in the world. especially the countries that have meritocratic admissions, and so it's a knot of very complicated problems. But I think where it roots in the heart is in a sense of lost status, and that's what can be so easily exploited by politicians who say, "Oh, come to me, I'll take care of you," because the real problem is the immigrants or whatever.
Well,
I
am totally on board with that notion of that loss of status, and I would say that it extends to beyond the notion of women threatening that status as well. I mean, I think there's also a real sense in this country of white men that people who are not white, men and women, are also threatening their status. But how is that? Okay, and so it seems to me that is the source of the crisis, and that the polarization is a function of that, because that's loss of status is real. And I guess the question is like, how does that particular group that is losing that status, how do they deal with it? And that to me, and that's where the fear comes in.
Yeah, that's where the fear comes in. And then in the feeling of powerlessness, there's the turning to scapegoating and blame, where it's not the real problems, it's the immigrants and so forth. So it's that whole nexus where the real problems get effaced, no one wants to solve them, where, as you say, instead of trying to figure out exactly how to address this loss of status through things like making higher education more affordable for lower middle class people, there is this deflection through the tax cut to the top income earners, and somehow why don't people unmask that and say we won't stand for that, we won't vote for that, our representatives should not vote for that? It's because they've been sold a bill of goods that's not the real problem at all. The real problem is the immigrants. And so unfortunately our president is a master of deflection. He is so good at taking your eyes away from the real problem, especially when something threatens him, but more generally. And so all this immigrant stuff, when immigration is actually, illegal immigration is at an all-time low, that is deflection. And there's no solution for the real problem. Again, healthcare. So healthcare obviously is a source of enormous fear in a lot of people's lives. And in states where they have people who are working well on this issue, there's some stability. My daughter lives in Colorado, and there, Hickenlooper has created kind of a simulacrum of a decent healthcare policy. Of course, he's trying to do this on the national level too, but in the state, there are certain policies that he's put in that make people more secure, but still, that people aren't crying out, we want stable health care. Some people are now. I think Obamacare has caught on and people don't want their benefits removed, but that has not been the outcry of everyone, is simply the result of deflection. Oh, that's not your problem. Your problem is these filthy immigrants coming across the border, and so on and so on. And so we really need to sit down and figure out what the problems are, and then we could solve them. I mean, look at the way that Hickenlooper and Kasich actually did sit down, Republican and Democrat, and try to come up with a candidate health bill. But the trouble is that everyone else is running left and running right, and no one is sitting down.
Well, I mean, how do we address that? I mean, I'm not sure, to be honest with you, that how would we address that? Because I'm skeptical that that people are going to be able to put these perspectives aside, and I'm skeptical that there really is as much of a shared sense of outcomes as you are. But how would we approach that?
Well, I think we have to start local, because deliberation is actually a lot better in our cities and in our states than it is right now at the national level, which is so profoundly polarized. But, we're having congressional races in this city that the two contested seats where there is a Republican incumbent who's facing a tough Democratic challenger, where there's a real debate about what the problems of suburban Chicago are and what are we going to do about them. I have preferences for one rather than the other in both of these races, but I have to say, the Republicans, because they're being pushed, they're really talking about the real issues, like clean energy is a big issue in one of the campaigns because one of the candidates is a clean energy entrepreneur, and he's making us have that discussion. Why don't we build in an area that's actually a natural one for Illinois for various reasons? The other district, the debate has revolved around health care more. But in any case, these issues are being debated seriously, and they're being debated in, I would say, to some extent in good faith, although the Republicans who now say, we need to solve the health care problem, actually voted for the doomed House health care bill. So let's see whether they really changed or whether they're just trying to win the election. But in any case, it's a lot better than what's going on at the national level.
But isn't that a function?
And so I think that.
But isn't the fact that you can find a locality where there's a lot less polarization a function of the fact that we actually, as a nation, really are in many respects polarized, but that we also have a tendency to self-sort on some level, and so any given locality is going to be less polarized than the aggregate of these localities because. That actually, I think social scientists will tell you that adds to the polarization. You have people congregating in like-minded clusters, but that those clusters aren't necessarily like-minded between them.
Well, you could try to say that. I think that actually in these particular cases that's not the case because we have two Republican incumbents who have been there for a dog's age, and they never had a serious challenge. And suddenly, more and more people going into politics, young people, talented people from all sectors of society, forcing a real discussion. And, self-sorting can only take you so far because in all these districts there are people who are hurting, and the healthcare issue touches us all. And so let's see. But what I want to say is that there, where you can look people in the eye, they are your neighbors, they are your associates. It's hard to be fake. It's harder to be totally fake. And I think that if we start with this, what I've seen is tremendous increase in political interest and political campaigning among young people, like in the one of these contested districts, there were actually 6 candidates in the Democratic primary, all good, actually. And the one who won was this clean energy entrepreneur. So he's very good. But in the other district, it was similar, that you had a lot of people turning out. And here's an African-American nurse who's a professor of nursing, and she was the winning one in the other district. She's immensely gifted, but somebody who probably would never have gone in for politics only like a few years ago, because she's a professor of nursing. She's doing fine. But so I think that's the solution, is we all need to get involved. The ignorance of local politics is incredible in this country. People, if you ask people, who's your congressperson? Yes, such a large proportion don't even know, and they don't get involved. But I think now that's actually changing. So one thing that the brouhaha over Trump has produced is much more political awareness, and I think that's crucial and great.
I would agree. I mean, talk just briefly about your proposal for a civic core of folks, and it to function, at least in terms of, aside from its, I guess, practical objectives, in terms of what it does for society is far more important.
Yeah, well, it responds to what you brought up earlier, that is the self-sorting. And what you see in this country is such great lack of experience of people who differ from you in class particularly and income level, but also in race. The two are, of course, very closely linked. There's such de facto segregation in housing in this city and in this larger urban area, and it's true across the whole country. So how do we get, more generally, young people to get out and learn what this country is like, to learn to meet people who are not like them? Now, in the past, one way people did that was through war. And so many stories I've heard from people both in this country and even more in Britain, because in Britain, everyone sort of older than me, the people who are my teachers, they all fought in the Second World War. And that is how they learned how the other half lives. But we don't want to start a war for that. So, my thought is we really, really need national youth service. Germany has had that for a number of years. They don't have it right now, but they had a choice between military service and civil service. But in this country, my picture would be that it would be all civil service, and it would be focused on things like elder care, where there's a huge amount of work to be done to take the burden off of families, but of women in particular, because there is no nursing care, unlike a lot of European countries where there is free nursing care available for people. We just don't have that, and the lives of aging people are very grim. Recent data about bankruptcies and so on. So, get people out taking care of children, taking care of aging people, but at the same time, they're going to a different place. They're meeting people that they didn't go to school with, and even universities, of course, are more and more preserves of the wealthy, with a few affirmative action people tucked in because of these high costs. It's more and more monotonous. So they need to get, after they graduate from university, go out and serve for about 2-3 years, and I think that would build a sense of a democratic nation, which we right now don't have anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see if we, I think we will, get past this moment of crisis. I think we may go through a little bit more crisis before this crisis is over. But if there aren't, some type of a move, I think, to sort of reconcile these differences in something like that. And I guess just lastly, like, what else? In the event that we are in an era where, I guess we have the ability to initiate these type of, and I think like a having a civic corps on some level, a mandatory civic corps in this country would be fairly radical.
Yeah, it would be hard. It would be hard politically.
But I think it could. If there is a moment coming out of a crisis, I think something like that could possibly happen. Is there any other sort of like broad-based policy that you think would address this type of thing?
Well, there are a lot of things, one is just making higher education more affordable. I'd rather do it not in the way that Bernie Sanders proposes, which would mean a tremendous transfer from the poor to the rich, because now the rich are paying full tuition at the major universities and the poor are not. So to make it free for everyone seems to me not such a good idea for that reason.
I think it's giving everybody an option. I don't think you don't think under.
Do you think rich people are going to volunteer to donate $60,000 a year to the University of Chicago? I mean, of course some do, and there are philanthropic people, but to go have their children pay full tuition is not a choice that people are going to easily make.
I think the proposal, I mean, just to be clear, I think that the proposal is that in each state there would be a free option, not that everyone's
Hillary's proposal was limited to state universities, but the Sanders proposal was all universities. And it was part of this movement to make Harvard free for everyone and so on.
I don't think that's the case. But I may be mistaken. My understanding was that Clinton's was there would be debt-free college where you would have an opportunity to work off your loans in the course of your college. That Sanders was there would be basically a public option, a free option. Not that everyone's college would be free. But maybe I'm wrong. But go ahead.
Well, he certainly wanted all colleges involved, not just the public universities. Anyway, there certainly is plenty to discuss here and how to do it. Let's have 100 good proposals before we come down on it. But, my other proposal is for the sustenance that people need emotionally to deal with this. I think we can get this through civic participation in a variety of ways, through local civic groups, through protest movements. I think religion plays an enormously valuable role for many, many, if not most Americans. And certainly in Chicago, you can see that in the African American community, the leadership in the kind of hope direction, leadership in the anti-gun movement and the anti-violence movement has been taken by the churches. And so, whatever seems to be productive at the local level, that's what I would support. I do think that we educators have a special responsibility to focus on teaching the skills of what I would call Socratic self-examination, what Socrates thought democracies needed, like really arguing, really looking people in the eye and saying, well, exactly how does this argument work and what are you for? Which, of course, we do in philosophy classes, but this is, of course, my beef more generally is that the humanities have been increasingly devalued in our universities and in our culture in favor of purely technical learning, and I think that's fatal if we're really going to remain a democracy.
Indeed. The book is The Monarchy of Fear. A philosopher looks at our political crisis. Martha Nussbaum, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Welcome back. What we're proposing as we run for president is the following. The United States is not Zimbabwe. But there's no reason why we can't Zimbabwe Yale, why we can't expropriate Columbia. I think a lot of people are looking around and they're saying, why can't every single kid in the tri-state area go to Princeton and also steal their dish collections as well? That's what we're proposing. Sorry. It's very immature of me. I couldn't help it.
Let 1,000 free premier educations bloom.
No. Let me be very clear. It is universal admittance, so the dumbest kids can go to the most Ivy schools, and it's free for everyone. I call it a socialism of guaranteed equal outcomes, so that the dumbest can walk through the halls of Yale for free. Matt needs to be up.
Can you imagine that actually being the policy, what it would look like the first fall that happens?
It'd be amazing.
And by the way, guess what's coming to Martha Nussbaum School? Cultural Revolution.
And eat your heart out, Milton Friedman.
I think if I could just sum up what my criticism is about Michael collects himself.
I really should not have done that joke. It was very self-indulgent.
I think my issue is
but I think everybody needed it.
It focuses too much on the people and not the organized part of it. Like, I think the problem in this country is not necessarily like popular racism, which is being appealed to, but the real problem is organized racism, like with Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump repeating like white genocide, like mottos.
Chris Kobach's whole policy map. All of these people. I mean,
it's not the people are divided, which gives license to this stuff. This stuff is happening, and it's confusing the hell out of the population.
I think people mix two problems, which is like there's a disconnect in culture generally, which is I am a total hippie subscriber that people should spend like less time on screens, more time with each other. Like, I think that's totally valid, necessary perspective. I don't know if that is the driver of our political conflicts, but anyways, I was trying so hard because Martha Nussbaum is a very important writer. She's written some very good books, but the college thing I had not heard this interview, so I was kind of coasting along. Oh, all right. Okay, this is an interesting exchange of ideas. Maybe, you know what? Maybe we ought to have more centrists on. It could be an interesting kind of debate series. And then
it is illustrative.
It is very illustrative. And then when we got to the Bernie Sanders college plan, then my lizard brain took over completely, and I couldn't help but be like, furthermore,
I'm triggering the libs in Cedar Rapids.
That's fair. I mean, we all know the root problem is capitalism, right? And the offshoot problems would be white supremacy and patriarchy. It's like a shitty Venn diagram of oppression. And then we have the problem of, Republicans now wanting to take a liberals class. It's like a third order thing.
Yeah. I'm trying. We'll see how it goes on the fun half. But yeah, I think that was illustrative. There's actually a lot of information there. Okay, folks. You support this show by becoming a member. This is a listener-supported show. Majority.fm/support. Become a member. Pennies a day. The Michael Brooks Show tomorrow night, because we're gone next week. We are doing a crew live show at 6 p.m. tomorrow night on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. The Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, which I'm sorry, Brendan, I should have sent you a link to. First of all, we cracked our first 6,000 subscribers, and we haven't even been up a month yet, which is great. And there's a lot of clips up there, so it will give you a sense of the flavor of that show. I think the thing that just went up, where we soberly assessed Kofi Annan's legacy from Bosnia to Iraq and the very premise of international law, and then flipped to, that's the wrong one.
No, scroll down a bit more because it's those are not public.
Yeah. So, and then we created our new Kofi Annan character, which I wanted which is Kofi Annan is a resistance warrior. So he went from Kofi, like, you look like a Cheeto. Maybe you should make out with your boyfriend, Putin.
Oh,
John
that's
Brennan
good.
is a patriot. Hashtag resistance.
I've never heard that before. It's really funny.
We had a lot of fun with that.
We couldn't decide whether to go Kofi Annan, which is like the QAnon.
Yeah, and then he would be on Al Jazeera going, it is just it means everything is okay. Why are people saying that I am throwing a sign? I don't know what this sign means.
But
I didn't even notice that Leo and Kanye were wearing the hats.
we put him through the paces live, and Kofi Annan strode ahead.
No, that really was. It was like somehow like the most prominent, like, ego subordinated diplomat of like the modern era. Just all of a sudden, like, Trump made him Ted Lieu. Like, oh really? Slave labor was good enough for us in the military, but not you, because you are not a patriot. Meanwhile, Chito Mussolini is talking about patriotism. What a joke. Putin is your boyfriend. Hashtag read Rick Wilson's book. David Frum had an amazing piece.
Look at your small hands.
Yeah, look at your small hands. There's a problem there. David Frum and I have had disagreements in the past about lying about Iraq and the illegality of the invasion, but he really is calling it right on Chito Mussolini. Hashtag resist. Okay. And then, of course, there's a ton of extra content. Woke Bros at Waz, Illicit Histories. We just recorded a primer on what's happening with the Turkish economic crisis. And then there's actually going to be an illicit history of Kofi Annan and the United Nations and Ghanaian leadership with Milton Alamati. And we're well on our way to our first 2,000 patrons. So thanks. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody. Antifada. Jamie, what's happening?
Well,
Martha Nussbaum next week.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yes, this week we have an interview with our friend Martha Nussbaum. We're going to talk about we just dropped an episode yesterday with Army Resistor Spencer Rapone,
That's
who
awesome.
You may know as the guy who wrote "Communism Will Win" in his cap at
A
his
follower
West Point
of the Nussbaum
graduation.
philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. Communism will win by listening and reaching across the aisle. As well as through,
Dad is definitely not here today.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
And the kids are playing.
I just want Sam to know that Michael started it, and I can't help it.
I don't think that needed to be said. I think literally when I went into the Bernie Zimbabwe impression, that was pretty self-evident.
Oh my God. But yeah, we talk with Spencer about the connection between capitalism and permanent imperial warfare. We talk about his own experience a little bit, how he got into and then out of the Army. We talk about some little history of war resistance during the Vietnam War, and the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which was a very awesome leftist revolution.
Did he tell the plane hijacking story, which I think was part of that?
No.
There's an amazing, and I think it was definitely in Portugal, but it was in the 70s when you could do stuff like this. Some anti-regime activist, leftist activist, hijacked an airplane, and they gave flowers to all of the women on the airplane, and they were like, nobody's going to be hurt, relax, and like, here you are, madame. And then the demand was they just dropped anti-regime leaflets all over Lisbon, and then they got flown to safety. Yeah, that's a pretty amazing story.
It's praxis.
That
That's
tracks
total
with,
praxis. Yep.
What I know about the Carnation Revolution, because there was hardly any violence whatsoever. Right. The people were with the army 100%. They were giving them red carnations in the streets. It was beautiful. So we talk about that, and we talk a little bit about the potential for communism to win in our lifetimes. So check
Love
it out.
it. Awesome. Matt, literary hangover.
The Custom House, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Speaking of Kofi Annan, he would have probably been big on the emoluments beat.
Oh, yeah.
And
it is all Lawrence Tribe Twitter thread. He has said it all. Oh, my God. Has everyone read Eric Garland? This is like the Dag Hammerstein of Twitter.
It turns out this sort of influence peddling is not entirely unprecedented. It used to be literally baked into patronage politics.
Right.
And Nathaniel Hawthorne was a big benefactor of that. So much so that he basically wrote. That's how he made he made more money from working as a customs house agent than he did as a novelist in his lifetime.
I would imagine so.
And because you just skim a little bit off the top when you work the docks. And then he got fired from that because the Whigs took power again, and he wrote the Scarlet Letter. So we go into that.
See, I would imagine, like, if you just told me generically that he skimmed money at a patronage job to subsidize his novel writing career, I would say, like, oh, Hawthorne's pretty cool.
Awesome.
I like him more than I thought I did, which I totally do. I respect everything that I just stated. But then you really illustrate that even historicized, he was an asshole.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did not expect to listen to a literary hang. I actually thought I was like, I've said this before. I was on a train in literally like the sunset of like beautiful New England, Connecticut. I was like, I'm going to listen to Literary Hangover and find out about Hawthorne. And I did not expect like 20 minutes later to be like, this guy's such a prick. Like just like unrepentant, like slavery defender. Total like 2008. Last thing I want. Maybe you're wrong about this, but put this on the docket too. Total like, Reddit like thread like I would if people didn't buy chicks books, I'd be more successful. Yeah. Like wow.
His most outright thing is the misogyny. He calls them scribbling women, but his race stuff. He does later come around on the Civil War to say like, well, if we're fighting this already, we might as well get rid of slavery. But his previous thing was that only God's going to be able to solve slavery, and if man tries to do it, it's just going to lead to something worse.
They did not tell us any of this when we read the Scarlet Letter in high school.
No, and it's funny because Hawthorne has been popular and in circulation ever since he was alive. Few authors you can say that about, and usually you reserve that for apolitical authors, or that's the thinking, but I think it's more because Hawthorne's politics kind of speak out of both sides of his mouth.
Well, that was another thing I noticed. I feel like and I've only read a couple of Dostoevsky's novels, but there was that kind of interesting, like, and Dostoevsky, I know, started as a radical and then got traumatized in jail and became a reactionary, but reading his novels were really interesting because in some ways they're obviously like pure reactionary defenses of like Orthodox Christianity, but there's also so many indictments of Russian aristocracy and the class system that you're like, what are you saying here, buddy? Like, and there seems to be a little bit of that in Hawthorne as well, because it's not like he isn't a critic and perceptive about the wrongs of his day.
Yeah,
either.
He's just kind of in his not even his like travel, but he was just kind of he had small horizons generally.
All right, Antifada, Literary Hangover, Michael Brooks Show, of course, The Majority Report, soon to be Fish Sucks, The Dead for Life, the Brendan Finn journey. It's coming.
Keep waiting, folks.
Okay, everybody, we'll see you on the fun half.
You are in for it. All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.